The flickering candlelight casts long shadows across the parchment as a quill scratches out words in the silence of the scriptorium. Tonight, we journey back through time's heavy curtain to an age where survival was measured not in years, but in daily battles against hunger, filth, and brutality. What we uncover may unsettle you. These were not the romanticized Middle Ages of storybooks, but a world where peasants chewed bread laced with hallucinogenic mold, where doctors treated fever by draining blood, and where justice was decided by holding red-hot iron. As darkness gathers outside your window, just as it once did around medieval villages, we invite you to light your own candle and join this exploration of humanity's most resilient century. Tell us where you watch from. Do these stone walls and straw beds seem distant from your world, or do some shadows of this age still linger in your streets? Share your thoughts as we proceed. And if these glimpses into our shared past move you, consider adding your voice to our Fellowship of History's students. The Vesper bell tolls. Let us begin where all proper medieval tales commence, with the struggle for daily bread that was anything but simple. As you settle in to witness how our ancestors survived against impossible odds, remember, every like and subscription helps preserve these hard-won lessons from fading into the mists of time. The past awaits. Imagine waking up not to the blaring of an alarm, but to the crowing of a rooster. Except this rooster sounds less like a cheerful morning greeting and more like a creature that's seen things. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and something suspiciously like rotting cabbage. You're not in your bed. You're not even in a bed. You're on a pile of straw that may or may not also be home to several species of insects. Welcome to the Middle Ages. This is a world where daily grind doesn't mean traffic jams or annoying co-workers. It means backbreaking labor from sunrise to sunset just to avoid starving to death. Where fast food isn't a drive-through, but a questionable hunk of bread that might contain rocks. Where taking a sick day could mean getting your blood drained by a guy who also thinks the moon causes madness. We like to romanticize this era. Knights in shining armor, grand castles, romantic chivalry. But the truth? The past was gross. It was brutal, and if you were magically dropped into the 14th century, you'd last about as long as a snowflake in a forge. Modern life has made us soft. We complain about Wi-Fi speeds, while medieval peasants were just hoping their teeth didn't shatter on today's bread. So, let's take a journey. A slow, uncomfortable, and occasionally horrifying stroll through daily life in medieval times. From food that could kill you to medicine that definitely would. From justice systems that made no sense to wars that never seemed to end. This isn't just history. This is a survival horror story. And you're the clueless protagonist who forgot to check the difficulty setting. By the end of this, you'll never look at your microwave dinner the same way again. Chapter 2. A Taste of Despair. The brutal reality of medieval food. Imagine sitting down to a meal where every bite is a gamble. Not the playful risk of trying a new restaurant, but the very real danger of broken teeth, hallucinations, or a slow, agonizing death. This was dining in the Middle Ages, a daily battle against hunger, contamination, and the constant threat of food that could kill you as easily as nourish you. For the common people, meals were an exercise in endurance. The centerpiece of their diet was pottage, a sad, simmering sludge that occupied the family hearth like an unwanted guest that never left. This watery gruel, thick with barley, peas, and whatever wilted greens could be scavenged, cooked continuously, for weeks on end. New ingredients were added when available, but the base remained. A murky broth that developed flavors modern palates would struggle to describe, let alone stomach. The pottage pot was rarely emptied, merely replenished, creating a culinary time capsule where today's meal might contain traces of last month's ingredients. Bread served as the other dietary pillar, though it bore little resemblance to the fluffy loaves we know today. Medieval bread was dense enough to stop an arrow, dark from coarse grinding and packed with uninvited extras. Millstones routinely shed fragments into the flour, meaning every mouthful came with the risk of cracking a tooth on stone shards. Worse still was the ever-present threat of ergot, a sinister fungus that grew on rye and transformed ordinary bread into a psychoactive nightmare. Those who consumed tainted loaves might find themselves writhing in agony as their limbs blackened with gangrene, or lost in terrifying hallucinations where neighbors appeared as demons. Some historians believe entire outbreaks of witch trial hysteria might be traced back to villages collectively tripping on bad bread. Meat existed as a distant dream for most peasants, appearing perhaps a handful of times a year in salted, smoked, or otherwise tortured forms. Without refrigeration, preservation methods walked a fine line between edible and hazardous. Wealthy households used expensive spices not for flavor, but to mask the taste of meat well into decomposition. The line between aged and rotten blurred alarmingly, and many a noble feast likely sent guests home with more than just memories of the entertainment. Fish presented its own special horror for inland communities. What arrived at market was often so heavily preserved it resembled wood more than food, salted, dried, or pickled into leathery strips that required soaking and vigorous chewing. The smell alone could clear a room, yet religious fasting laws forced even the wealthy to choke down these maritime atrocities several days each week. Coastal dwellers fared slightly better, though even their fresh catch often arrived at market after hours in the sun, buzzing with flies. Perhaps most shocking to modern sensibilities was the drinking situation. With water sources routinely contaminated by human and animal waste, the safest liquid to consume was actually weak, low-alcohol ale. This wasn't the craft beer we know today, but a mildly fermented grain beverage that even children drank regularly. The average peasant might consume several pints daily, meaning much of the population moved through life in a permanent state of slight inebriation. Monasteries became centers of brewing not for recreation, but because their beer was reliably safer than local water sources. For the nobility, dining served as theater, a chance to display wealth through obscene excess. Multi-course feasts featured elaborate meat sculptures, exotic spices, and sugarwork so valuable it was literally worth its weight in silver. Yet even these displays of opulence hid dark truths. Food adulteration ran rampant, with bread padded with sawdust, wine cut with water, and milk stretched with chalk. Table manners would horrify modern diners. Knives served as universal utensils, with diners using their personal blades to spear morsels from shared plates. Napkins were rare luxuries, and it was perfectly acceptable to wipe greasy hands on clothing or even the family dog. The contrast between classes never appeared more stark than at mealtime. While peasants starved on gruel that barely sustained life, nobles gorged themselves into gout-ridden misery. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was power, status, and sometimes a weapon. The medieval kitchen was a place of wonder and terror, in equal measure, where a single meal could mean survival or suffering, celebration or slow poisoning. Chapter 3. The stench of survival, daily life in a world without cleanliness. Picture waking not to birdsong, but to the thick, clinging odor of last night's chamber pot. Your nostrils flare against the assault, a cocktail of human waste, rotting food, and the sour tang of bodies that haven't known soap in months. This is morning in the Middle Ages, where cleanliness wasn't just neglected, but often feared as a threat to health itself. The toilet situation alone would break a modern person. Most homes relied on chamber pots, simple buckets that sat in corners or under beds, their contents waiting to be flung into the street with a shouted warning. Those living in castles might have garderobes, stone seats that emptied directly down the outer walls, leaving streaks of filth that baked in the sun. In London, public latrines perched precariously over the Thames, while common folk simply relieved themselves in alleyways or against buildings. The famous cry of "Gardez-vous," a corruption of the French "Gardez-l'eau," served as the only warning. Before waste came raining down from upper windows. Someone had to deal with this growing mountain of filth, and that someone was the gong farmer. These unfortunate souls worked exclusively at night, shoveling human waste from cesspits and carting it beyond city walls. Though paid 4 times a labourer's wage, no amount of coin could mask the permanent stench that clung to them like a second skin. Their very presence was considered a public nuisance, banned from taverns and markets by royal decree. Bathing existed in a strange state of suspicion. While the wealthy might indulge in occasional baths, often with herbs or flower petals to mask body odour, most believed water could carry disease through the skin. The church warned that excessive cleanliness might invite sin, and many physicians agreed that dirt formed a protective barrier against illness. As a result, people might go months without proper washing, relying instead on rubbing themselves with dry cloths or changing their linen undergarments, the medieval equivalent of a shower. The consequences of this hygiene vacuum crawled through every aspect of life. Lice infested hair so thoroughly that special combs became standard household items. Fleas thrived in straw mattresses and clothing seams, their constant bites leaving skin covered in angry red welts. Bedbugs crept through the night, their feasting so common that people simply accepted the itching as part of existence. The Black Death would later exploit these conditions perfectly, its flea-borne bacteria finding ideal hosts in the unwashed masses. City streets presented their own special horror. Without garbage collection, refuse piled in stinking heaps, butcher's offal mingling with tanners' chemical runoff, animal carcasses rotting beside human waste. Rain transformed lanes into rivers of filth, while summer heat baked the mess into a choking miasma. Some cities attempted sanitation laws, but enforcement was sporadic at best. London's solution, dumping waste into the Thames, simply created a flowing sewer that poisoned downstream villages. Dental care amounted to little more than wishful thinking. Without toothbrushes, people might rub their teeth with cloth or chew aromatic herbs, but decay ran rampant. Medieval skeletons show shocking patterns of tooth loss and abscesses. When pain became unbearable, the solution was extraction with crude pincers. No anesthesia, no sterilization, just brute force. And prayers. Some dentists claimed magical cures, but most victims simply endured until the tooth either fell out or killed them via infection. Oddly, the wealthy sometimes wore their stench as a badge of honor. Kings and nobles might go weeks without bathing, believing body odor demonstrated vitality and vigor. Perfumes and pomanders, scented balls carried or worn around the neck, served more to mask odors than eliminate them. A noble's approach to hygiene often involved covering dirt with rosewater rather than removing it. This was daily life in a world where cleanliness wasn't just impossible, but often undesirable. The modern obsession with sanitation would have seemed bizarre to medieval people, who accepted stench and filth as inevitable as sunrise. Yet this very acceptance created perfect conditions for disease and suffering on an unimaginable scale. Chapter 4. The Crushing Weight of Survival. Work and exploitation in the Middle Ages. The first light of dawn had not yet touched the horizon when the village bell tolled. You wake not to an alarm, but to the dull ache in your bones from yesterday's labor. The straw beneath you offers no comfort, the lingering scent of sweat and damp earth clinging to your tunic. Another day begins, not with coffee and commutes, but with the certainty of backbreaking toil until the last light fades. This was not a job, this was survival. For the vast majority, life was dictated by the land. Peasants didn't farm. They wrestled existence from soil that seemed determined to starve them. The fields were not picturesque meadows, but battlefields, where every inch of growth was paid for in sweat and pain. The wooden plough, dragged by an ox more skeletal than sturdy, tore at the earth with cruel inefficiency. Each furrow demanded hours of labor, the work so grueling that even the strongest men collapsed by midday, and this was just the beginning. Harvest season was a special kind of torture. Under the unrelenting sun, you bent double, swinging a sickle until your hands blistered and your spine screamed for relief. A single acre could demand 300 of these agonizing cuts. There were no breaks, no pauses, only the knowledge that if you slowed, your family would starve come winter. And when the grain was finally gathered, the flail took over, its rhythmic pounding sending waves of pain through already exhausted arms. The church called it God's plan. It felt more like damnation. Children were not spared. By 7, they were put to work, herding animals with nothing but a stick against wolves, picking stones from fields until their fingers bled. Or worse, sent down mine shafts so narrow they could never stand upright. Girls carried water buckets so heavy their growth was stunted. Boys learned the scythe before they could properly lift it. There was no childhood, only a slow initiation into the same misery their parents endured. For those not bound to the soil, work was often worse. Tanners spent their days knee-deep in vats of urine and dog feces, the stench so potent they were banned from public gatherings. Fullers trampled cloth in troughs of human waste, their feet rotting from the ammonia. Miners choked on black dust in tunnels that collapsed as often as not, their lungs turning to tar by 30. And these were the lucky ones, the ones with trades. The truly desperate sold themselves as human torches, lighting the way for nobles, with flammable, pitch-soaked rags tied to their bodies. Women's labor was invisible, but unending. Between backbreaking field work, they brewed, spun, wove, and cooked, all while enduring constant pregnancies. A single tunic required 200 hours of spinning alone. Childbirth was a gamble with death, attended by midwives whose best tools were superstition and hope. And when the sun set, their work didn't end, only shifted to mending by rushlight, fingers moving ceaselessly lest winter find the family without protection. The cruelty of the system was in its precision. Wages were calculated to keep you desperate, just enough to buy bread, never enough to escape. Fines for imagined infractions ate what little you saved. Your children inherited your debts, binding them to the same fate. The church preached this was the natural order. Revolt was rare not because people accepted it, but because exhaustion leaves no room for rebellion. This was not living. This was a slow, grinding consumption of body and soul. The next time you dread your job, remember, at least your work doesn't. Leave your hands permanently twisted, your lungs full of filth, or your children doomed before they can walk. Chapter 5. The Theatre of Cruelty, Justice and Punishment in the Middle Ages. The accused man stands trembling before the crowd, his crime echoing in the morning air, a stolen loaf of bread to feed his starving children. The sentence comes swift and certain. His right hand will be severed at the wrist. As the blacksmith's axe falls, the marketplace cheers. This wasn't brutality. This was justice in a world where punishment served as both spectacle and warning. Forget notions of fair trials and proportional sentencing. Medieval justice operated on principles that would make even the most hardened modern juror blanch. The law existed not to rehabilitate or even primarily to protect, but to enforce order through terror. A nobleman might pay a blood price for murdering a peasant, while that same peasant would hang for poaching a rabbit from the Lord's woods. The scales of justice weren't blind. They were permanently tilted toward power. The trial process itself was often a form of punishment. Without forensic science or proper legal representation, your fate might rest on divine intervention rather than evidence. Trial by ordeal placed your life in God's hands. Literally, you might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar 9 paces, your guilt or innocence determined by whether the burns festered in the coming days. More terrifying still was trial by water, where you'd be bound and thrown into a river, sinking. Proved your innocence, if you didn't drown first, while floating marked you as guilty and destined for the gallows. For those of noble birth, trial by combat offered an aristocratic alternative. Wealthy defendants could hire professional champions to fight in their stead, turning legal proceedings into bloody tournaments where victory meant divine vindication. The poor face their accusers directly, their lives quite literally resting in their own untrained hands. Punishments were designed not just to hurt, but to humiliate and terrify. The stocks and pillory turned minor offenders into public entertainment, their faces exposed to whatever filth or projectiles the crowd might provide. More serious crimes brought creative horrors. Thieves might lose hands, liars their tongues, blasphemers their skin peeled away in strips. Execution methods became gruesome public spectacles, burning at the stake for heretics, drawing and quartering for traitors who were hanged until nearly dead, then disemboweled while still conscious, and drowning in specially constructed cages for suspected witches. The justice system's true cruelty lay in its inconsistency. Laws varied wildly between regions. An act legal in one village might bring mutilation just a day's walk away. Local lords often served as judge, jury, and executioner, their personal whims determining sentences. Corruption ran rampant, with wealthy offenders buying their way out of punishment, while the poor suffered disproportionately for minor infractions. Perhaps most disturbing was how these punishments became public entertainment. Execution days drew crowds larger than festivals, with families bringing picnics to watch men die screaming. The suffering of others served as both warning and diversion in a world where violence was commonplace. Yet within this system of sanctioned brutality, glimpses of humanity occasionally surfaced. Juries sometimes refused to convict starving thieves. Communities might shelter those fleeing unjust lords. Even the most hardened executioners were known to show mercy, ensuring quick deaths, despite sentences demanding prolonged agony. Chapter 6. The Machinery of Carnage, the true face of medieval warfare. The young conscript's hands tremble as he grips his spear, the weight unfamiliar and awkward in his peasant's calloused palms. Around him, the camp buzzes with a grim energy. The metallic rasp of blades being sharpened, the nervous laughter of men trying to ignore tomorrow's terror, the low moans of wounded from the previous skirmish. The air hangs thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, horse dung, and the ever-present tang of iron from blood-rusted armor. This is not the glorious battlefield of minstrels' tales. This is the meat grinder of medieval warfare, where honor dies screaming in the mud, and survival favors not the brave, but the brutally pragmatic. The myth of chivalry shatters upon first contact with reality. Those gleaming knights in tournament armor exist, yes, but they're vastly outnumbered by the grim reality of medieval soldiery. A full suit of plate armor costs more than a peasant village's entire annual harvest. Only nobles and the wealthiest mercenaries can afford such protection. The common foot soldier makes do with a padded gambeson, perhaps a rusted mail shirt looted from a corpse, if he's particularly fortunate. The poorest levies arrive with nothing but agricultural tools hastily modified into weapons. Scythe blades, straightened into makeshift spears, flails converted into morning stars. These are not professional soldiers, but farmers dragged from their fields, given minimal training, and thrust into the slaughterhouse. Battle formations reveal the cold mathematics of medieval combat. The English longbowmen, their spines permanently deformed from years of drawing 150-pound bows, can loose 15 arrows per minute in deadly arcs. At Agincourt, their arrows transform the French advance into a nightmare of stumbling, plate-armored men drowning in mud, their expensive harnesses becoming liquid tombs. The aftermath isn't the neat battle diagrams of history books, but weeks of scavengers moving through fields of bloated corpses, prying gold teeth from dead knights with dagger points. The victors round up wounded enemies for ransom or execution, while camp followers strip the dead naked, leaving flesh to bloat in the sun until the burial pits are dug. Siege warfare reduces conflict to its most psychologically devastating form. When armies aren't clashing in open fields, they're engaged in these prolonged exercises in human suffering. For defenders trapped within castle walls, life becomes an accelerating nightmare. Within weeks, rations dwindle to mouldy grain stores and whatever rats can be caught. The castle's courtyards transform into open sewers as latrines overflow, the stench mingling with the sweet rot smell of gangrenous wounds. Noblemen hoard secret food caches, while common soldiers and servants watch their children's ribs emerge. With cruel definition, the desperate resort to eating leather straps, book bindings, and eventually, when the silence becomes unbearable, the bodies of the recently deceased. Attackers outside the walls face different but equally horrific conditions. Their siege camps become festering pits of disease, where men sleep in mud-filled trenches under constant arrow fire from the walls. Dysentery spreads like wildfire through water sources contaminated by their own waste. The ever-present risk of exposing oneself to relieve bodily needs leads to men taking crossbow bolts in embarrassing and fatal places. Mining operations beneath castle walls continue for weeks in claustrophobic darkness, where a single misstep could bring tons of earth crushing down or result in emerging into an enemy counter-tunnel filled with waiting blades. When starvation fails to break the defenders, besiegers construct horrific siege engines, not just catapults, but rotting animal carcass hurlers designed to spread disease, or primitive flamethrowers spraying Greek fire that burns even on water. The mercenary companies operating in this hellscape develop reputations for both extreme effectiveness and casual brutality. These professional soldiers for hire follow no flag but money, and their loyalty lasts exactly as long as their pay. When wages lag, they're just as likely to sack their employers' cities as enemy ones. The White Company, one of the most feared Italian mercenary bands, becomes notorious for its innovative tactics and complete absence of scruples. Their contracts include specific clauses about plunder rights and rape allowances, the dark paperwork of organized violence. For the common people caught between these warring factions, the choices are all terrible. Fleeing means abandoning homes and crops to certain destruction, likely dying of exposure on the road. Staying invites multiple horrors. Occupying forces demand food and supplies at sword point, while retreating armies practice scorched earth policies to deny resources to pursuers. The worst fate befalls towns deemed to have supported the wrong side. Mass executions, systematic rape, and the thorough destruction of everything that might sustain life. Chroniclers record incidents where garrisons refusing to surrender watch, as besiegers catapult their captured families over the walls in pieces. Medical care for the wounded is almost comically inadequate by modern standards. Arrow wounds require probing for the head, often driving it deeper before retrieval. Deep. Cuts are cauterized with boiling oil or red-hot irons, the screams echoing through camp. Amputations are performed with saws, rarely cleaned between patients, the lucky ones receiving a leather strap to bite during the operation. Infections are near universal, treated with poultices of moldy bread or honey if any treatment is given at all. The medieval understanding of germ theory consists mainly of noting that wounds stink before killing their owners. The psychological toll of medieval warfare leaves invisible scars. Veterans return home missing limbs or bearing grotesque facial scars, their nightmares populated by memories of friends trampled under cavalry charges or burned alive in siege engine attacks. Some turn to religion, making pilgrimages to atone for battlefield atrocities. Others embrace the violence, becoming bandits or signing on with new mercenary companies. Many simply drink themselves into early graves, their trauma undocumented in an era without psychology. This is the true face of medieval warfare, not the sanitized version of heroic charges and courtly romance, but a grinding machine of suffering, where the only true victors are the carrion birds growing fat on the aftermath. The next time modern military tactics seem harsh, consider that at least contemporary soldiers aren't expected to fight in wool garments soaked with weeks of sweat and blood, or to march on feet wrapped in rotting rags. The medieval battlefield was less a test of courage than a demonstration of how much horror the human body can endure before stopping. Chapter 7. The Harvest of Bones, Plague and Pestilence in the Medieval World. The first fever comes quietly, a slight warmth behind the eyes, a stiffness in the joints easily blamed on yesterday's labor. By morning, the skin blooms with dark. Flowers, buboes swelling in the groin and armpits, hot to the touch and throbbing with every heartbeat. The village healer makes the sign of the cross and backs away. There will be no treatment, no mercy, only the waiting. This is how the world ends, not with war or famine, but with the silent creep of infection through filthy streets. The Black Death needs no swords or siege engines. Its weapons are fleas and rats and the very air people breathe. By the time the first corpse collapses in the marketplace, half the town is already doomed. The plague enters Europe in 1347 through a Genoese trading ship from the east. Sailors lie dead at their stations, their skin mottled black, their cabins swarming with infected rats. Authorities order the vessel burned, but it's too late. The death has already stepped ashore. Within months, the pandemic spreads like ink through parchment. Florence loses 3/4 of its people in a single summer. Paris stacks corpses like firewood outside the city walls. In Avignon, the Pope retreats to his chambers, burning aromatic herbs to ward off miasma as 400 citizens die daily. The living cannot bury the dead fast enough. Mass graves yawn open, swallowing entire families without markers or last rites. Physicians don their beaked masks, the hollow noses stuffed with pungent herbs. They bleed patients, lance buboes, prescribe potions of crushed emeralds and powdered unicorn horn. Every treatment accelerates death. The plague laughs at their pretensions. The sick die in ways that defy medieval understanding. Bubonic, swellings burst, flooding beds with pus and blood. Pneumonic, victims drown in their own fluids, lips turning blue. Septicemic, people go to bed healthy and never wake up. Churches empty as people realize prayer provides no protection. Priests, hearing final confessions. Gravediggers succumb while digging their own replacements' graves. The social order crumbles. Masters and servants fall equally. In the plague's shadow, humanity reveals its dual nature. Some devote themselves to caring for the sick, knowing infection means death. Others bar their doors, leaving screaming children to starve beside their parents' corpses. Flagellant cults march from town to town, their bare backs striped with self-inflicted wounds. They preach that the plague is God's punishment, their bloody processions spreading terror instead of comfort. In Germany, they turn their wrath outward. Jewish communities are burned alive by mobs desperate for someone to blame. The wealthy flee to country estates, but the plague follows. The poor die where they stand, in fields, in workshops, collapsed over ploughs mid-furrow. Animals wander untended, their owners mouldering in ditches. Crops rot unharvested. The very concept of time distorts. Without priests to ring the hours, without markets to mark the days, survivors lose track of weeks. When the dying finally slows, the world is unrecognizable. Villages stand empty, weeds growing through cottage floors. Inheritance laws mean nothing. Entire estates pass to whoever is left to claim them. The laboring classes, now scarce, demand higher wages. Landlords resist, prompting the first workers. Revolts. The plague doesn't disappear. It returns every generation, a hungry guest who always knows where to find the table set. Each visitation carries away the young and replenished, keeping Europe's population stunted for centuries. Art turns macabre. Dancing skeletons in illuminated manuscripts, tomb carvings showing corpses mid-decay. People build ossuaries, stacking, bones in decorative patterns because churchyards can hold no more. The collective trauma reshapes religion, philosophy, and the very conception of life's value. This is the true face of medieval pandemic, not a historical footnote, but an ongoing nightmare that colored every aspect of existence. The next time modern people complain about mask mandates or vaccines, let them remember the carts piled high with bodies, the empty villages, the parents who had to choose which child to feed. Our worst public health crises are mild inconveniences compared to the harvest reaped by the Black Death. Chapter 8. The Crumbling Pillars. Faith and Fear in the Aftermath of Plague. The cathedral doors groan open to reveal a sight that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. A handful of worshippers scatter across pews that once overflowed. With the faithful, the priest's voice echoes through vaulted ceilings built for crowds now lying in mass graves. Where incense once masked the scent of living bodies, now the stone walls exhale the damp chill of abandonment. This is the spiritual crisis of the late Middle Ages, not the loss of God, but the terrifying realization that he might not care. The Black Death did more than kill half of Europe. It shattered the medieval mind's most fundamental assumptions. For centuries, the Church had promised order and meaning, suffering as divine test, death as gateway to salvation. But when entire monasteries succumbed despite their piety, when prayers and relics failed to stop the dying, when even the sacraments became vectors of death as priests carried plague from sickbed to sickbed, people began asking dangerous questions. Monastic chronicles from the period reveal the crisis of faith in raw detail. A Benedictine monk in Kent records watching 7 of his brothers die in a single week, their holy vows offering no protection. "We buried them without rites," he writes, "for there was no one left to sing the offices." In Avignon, a papal scribe notes that the price of absolution has tripled as desperate souls pay anything for last rites, only to find the priests who took their coin dead the next morning. The Church's infrastructure crumbles faster than its theology can adapt. New forms of devotion emerge from the trauma. Flagellant processions grow more extreme, their rituals evolving into public spectacles of atonement. Groups of 50 or 100 men march from town to town, their bare backs crisscrossed with scars from the iron-tipped whips they wield. They claim their blood forms a protective circle around communities, but terrified magistrates soon ban them as plague spreaders. The movement fractures into heretical sects, preaching that the Church itself is the whore of Babylon. The persecution of Jews escalates from sporadic violence to systematic extermination. In Strasbourg, chronicles describe townspeople herding hundreds of Jews into wooden buildings set ablaze, not out of conviction, but because the city council promised it would stop the plague. The real reason becomes clear when municipal records show the cancelled debts of Jewish moneylenders being redistributed among Christian merchants. God's judgment proves conveniently profitable for those enforcing it. Meanwhile, the plagues, recurring visitations create a society permanently braced for apocalypse. Last wills and testaments from the period show people leaving money not for grandchildren's futures, but for their own elaborate funeral monuments. The wealthy commission memento mori art, skulls carved into prayer books, paintings showing decomposing corpses as they'll look in a few years. A new genre of literature emerges, the ars moriendi, manuals teaching how to die well when death might come by nightfall. The church struggles to reassert control. In England, bishops order parish priests to stop preaching about the plague as divine punishment, recognizing it drives people toward despair rather than piety. The Vatican sponsors new saints' cults, promoting figures like Saint Roch, allegedly immune to plague, as intermediaries. But the damage is done. When the Great Schism splits the papacy between rival claimants in Rome and Avignon, many see it as confirmation the institution has lost divine favor. Beneath the spiritual crisis simmers a socio-economic revolution. With half the workforce dead, surviving peasants realize their labor has unprecedented value. In England, the Statute of Labourers tries to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, prompting the first mass workers' revolts. A sermon from 1381 captures the mood. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The question terrifies the nobility more than any plague. Art and literature reflect the shifting worldview, where early medieval paintings showed orderly hierarchies of saints and angels. Late 14th century works teem with chaotic, grotesque imagery. Cathedral gargoyles grow more monstrous, their twisted forms mirroring the psychological scars outside. The church walls. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the plague's shadow, presents a world where corrupt clergy and lusty widows get more pageantry than saints. The plague's deepest impact may be on the concept of time itself. Before 1347, medieval art depicted death as a singular event at life's end. Afterward, the danse macabre shows skeletons leading people of all ages to the grave, the young and healthy no safer than the old. Calendars begin marking anniversaries of plague years like battle commemorations. Time is no longer a straight path toward salvation, but a series of uncertain intervals between visitations of the Reaper. This is the true legacy of the medieval plague, not just the bodies it took, but the minds it changed. The crisis of faith it triggered would eventually give birth to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the slow dawn of scientific medicine. But for those living through the aftermath, there was only the daily struggle to reconcile a capricious universe with the need to plant next year's crops. Chapter 9. The twilight of an era, decline and transformation in the late Middle Ages. The travelling scholar pauses at the crest of the hill, his worn boots coated with dust from roads that have carried him across a changing world. Below him stretches a landscape of contradictions, a half-abandoned village beside a newly prosperous market town, the blackened timbers of a burned monastery standing in the shadow of a merchant's ornate stone house. The wind carries the scent of wood smoke and decay, of fresh-cut lumber and rotting harvests left unclaimed. This is the late medieval world in its death throes and rebirth, where the old order crumbles even as something new struggles to be born. Signs of transformation appear everywhere for those with eyes to see them. In the cities, guild halls grow more ornate, while their masters quietly abandon the medieval ideal of fair pricing. A new breed of merchant calculates profits in ledgers, bound in fine Italian leather, their wealth surpassing that of minor nobles. The marketplace buzzes with rumors of ventures beyond the known world, of Portuguese ships feeling their way down the African coast, of mysterious lands beyond the Islamic empires where spices grow like weeds. The world is widening, and with each passing year, the medieval mind's horizons stretch until they threaten to tear. Out in the countryside, the old feudal bonds grow slack and frayed. Lords who once commanded absolute obedience now haggle with peasants over days of labor owed. Some manors stand empty altogether, their fields reverting to wilderness after the plague carried off entire communities. The surviving peasants grow. Bold, they wear clothes once reserved for their betters, they question ancient obligations, they whisper about a time when all men might be equal. The 1381 Peasants' Revolt in England may have been crushed, but its embers continue to smoulder in 1,000 village tavern conversations. The church, that great pillar of medieval society, shows cracks running through its foundation. After the scandal of rival popes excommunicating each other, even common folk dare to question clerical authority. Lollard preachers move through the countryside with forbidden English Bibles, arguing that God speaks to ploughmen as clearly as to priests. In Bohemia, Jan Hus's fiery sermons against church corruption attract crowds that alarm both bishops and kings. The printing press, still a new and dangerous invention, begins spitting out pamphlets that circulate from hand to eager hand. Authorities burn the offenders when they catch them, but the words have a way of escaping the flames. Warfare, too, undergoes a slow metamorphosis. The age of chivalry expires on battlefields where English longbowmen and Swiss pikemen prove that disciplined commoners can topple mounted knights. Castles, those mighty symbols of feudal power, become obsolete as gunpowder weapons grow more reliable. A new breed of professional soldier emerges, men who fight not out of loyalty but for regular wages, their allegiance following the deepest purse. Kings consolidate power, their bureaucracies expanding while the old nobility watches helplessly as their privileges erode. The state is being born, and its midwives are tax collectors and standing armies. Even the medieval worldview fractures. Under new pressures, the stars no longer seem fixed in their crystalline spheres as astronomers detect irregularities in their motions. Ancient medical texts fail to explain why some plagues strike the rich in their palaces while sparing filthy slums. The discovery of lost classical works challenges centuries of theological certainty, introducing ideas that bubble beneath the surface of universities like magma beneath thin crust. Artists begin painting landscapes with realistic perspective, as if the world could be viewed through human eyes rather than God's perfect geometry. Yet for all these changes, the medieval world clings stubbornly to life. In remote villages, farmers still mark time by saints' days and harvests, their lives little changed from their great-grandfather's time. Old women whisper charms over sick children even as educated physicians study Galen. Knights continue to joust in tournaments, though everyone knows their armor is now as ceremonial as it is practical. The past does not surrender easily to the future. It fights a long retreat, yielding ground inch by bloody inch. The scholar sighs and adjusts his pack. He carries within it both the old world and the new, a battered copy of Augustine's city, of God, wrapped around a sheaf of revolutionary astronomical calculations. As he walks down toward the village, he wonders what his grandchildren will make of this twilight era. Will they remember it as a time of decline, or the pregnant darkness before dawn? The answer, he suspects, depends on who wins the struggles now beginning in earnest. For we who look back, the late Middle Ages present a paradox, a period of profound loss and extraordinary creativity, of terrifying uncertainty and exhilarating possibility. The medieval world did not so much end as transform, its essence distilled and repurposed for new times. The next age would build using medieval foundations even as it mocked medieval superstitions. The Renaissance would borrow medieval scholarship even as it claimed to rediscover it. The Reformation would channel medieval piety even as it shattered medieval unity. As we close this examination of the medieval world, let us not dismiss it as primitive or romanticize it as simpler. Those who lived through its crises and triumphs were neither noble savages nor ignorant brutes. They were people like us, doing their best to navigate a world that often made little sense. Their solutions created our problems, just as our solutions will create future dilemmas. The wheel turns, but the road remains. Chapter 10, Echoes in the Stone, the Medieval Legacy in Our Modern World. The last light of evening falls across the ancient cathedral floor, illuminating worn stones where millions of footsteps have passed over centuries. Tourists with smartphones wander the nave, oblivious to how the building's very proportions whisper secrets of a lost worldview. The medieval period never truly ended. It merely folded itself into the foundations of our modern existence, its fingerprints visible everywhere if one knows where to look. Our daily lives remain bound by medieval inventions we scarcely notice. The mechanical clock, born in monastery towers to mark canonical hours, now rules our lives with its relentless ticking. University lecture halls still follow the model established in medieval Bologna and Paris, their gowns and degrees direct, descendants of academic traditions from 8 centuries past. The modern corporation traces its lineage to medieval guilds, complete with their hierarchies and quality control measures. Even our obsession with celebrity finds its precursor in the cults of saints that once dominated popular devotion. The medieval mind shaped physical spaces in ways we can't escape. Walk through any major European city and notice how the old town centres still follow their medieval footprints, the winding streets having outlasted countless modern planning schemes. Suburban subdivisions unconsciously echo the medieval villages. Arrangement, houses clustered together for protection, with open land beyond. Our hospitals preserve the layout of their monastic predecessors, where the sick were arranged in wards beneath vaulted ceilings, said to encourage healing vibrations. Language carries medieval baggage we've forgotten how to unpack. When we speak of feeling blue or having a black mood, we invoke humoral theory's insistence that bodily fluids governed emotions. Our fairy tales retain their medieval bones beneath Disney's polish. The original Sleeping Beauty wasn't awakened by true love's kiss, but by a nursing infant sucking the poisoned flax from her finger. The modern fantasy genre owes more to medieval romance than most authors realize, its tropes of questing knights and magical swords recycled from Chrétien, de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach. Political systems still wrestle with medieval ghosts. The tension between centralized authority and local autonomy plays out in debates that would have felt familiar to barons, forcing King John to sign Magna Carta. Modern bureaucracies operate on principles first developed by medieval monarchs desperate to govern sprawling territories. Even our contemporary conspiracy theories about secret societies and hidden knowledge find their roots in medieval fears about Templars and alchemists. The digital age has unexpectedly resurrected medieval ways of thinking. Social media's viral spread of information mirrors how rumors traveled through medieval market towns. Online echo chambers recreate the intellectual isolation of medieval villages. Our debates about misinformation and fake news parallel medieval struggles with heresy and unreliable manuscripts. The Internet's gift economy, from open-source software to Wikipedia, strangely resembles medieval concepts of communal knowledge before the rise of strict copyright. Economic patterns show equally deep medieval roots. The gig economy unwittingly revives the precarious existence of medieval journeymen moving between temporary jobs. Modern craft breweries consciously model themselves on monastic brewing traditions. Farmers' markets proudly embrace what was once simple necessity, the direct sale of goods without middlemen. Even our current struggles with pandemic response recall medieval cities vacillating between quarantine measures and economic concerns during plague outbreaks. Perhaps most profoundly, our relationship with time remains fundamentally medieval. The Christian calendar still structures our year, its holidays stubbornly resisting all attempts at commercialization. The 7-day week persists as one of history's most successful cultural exports from the Middle East through medieval Europe. Our work-life balance debates continue, arguments first voiced by medieval theologians insisting on Sabbath rest. As night falls completely and the cathedral prepares to close, a final irony emerges. The very act of studying the Middle Ages as a distinct historical period is itself a medieval invention. The Renaissance thinkers who coined the term Middle Ages were engaging in the same kind of epoch-defining that medieval chroniclers did when they spoke of a dark age after Rome's fall. We cannot escape the medieval habit of categorizing history, even as we attempt to categorize the medieval. This is the true medieval legacy. Not a collection of artifacts behind museum glass, but a living foundation beneath our feet. The people of the Middle Ages were not primitive ancestors to pity, nor noble savages to romanticize, but complex humans who built systems durable enough to carry their essence across centuries. Their solutions created our problems, their innovations our starting points, their dreams our inherited responsibilities. The great wheel of history never truly breaks with the past. It simply rotates, bringing different facets to the light, while keeping others in shadow. As we face our own era's transformations, we would do well to remember that future generations may one day study our time with the same mixture of awe and puzzlement that we bring to the medieval world. The stones remain, only the interpretations change.